This podcast is brought to you by the Phoenix Games Club. We are a long-standing RPG and board gaming group based in East London, operating out of Plaistow. Due to the coronavirus and our commitment to ensuring the safety of our members, as well as others, our usual venue is presently unavailable, but we do have and operate an active online presence. If you would like to get involved with games discussions, as well as make new friends, please use the links in the show notes. We're always looking for more people, whether you're experienced in tabletop RPGs or entirely new. And now, on with the show. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of To Ashes You Say, the companion podcast to the Phoenix Games Club. I'm Nick, your host, and joining me this evening are Chairman Kieran and Treasurer Andy.
Hello.
Hello.
So this evening we would like to share with you some of our lessons we have learned in our years of running and playing games. I think we're going to try and have an open discussion on the best practices and some of the more interesting lessons that we have learned. We have a large number of topics to get through tonight, so we'll begin with Kieran, but first I would like to open the discussion to you all that are listening. If you have any stories or lessons that you have learned, please share them with us and your fellow listeners. We'd love to hear from you all. With that said, Kieran, if you'd like to introduce the first topic.
So, the first topic that we have is effectively talking about preparedness for sessions. So the first point that we'd like to raise would be to be prepared for sessions that you're running, but don't over-prepare. So I've got a story to tell after this, but effectively you should, with most of your stories, you should prepare perhaps 2 or 3 sessions in advance, but not in so great a detail that you're spending hours doing it.
I believe there's a saying that goes, no plan survives first contact with the players.
Very true.
Yeah,
and I think that was very true. There's a great story, which was I was preparing a Lich's Tower in the Underdark. And I had Andy's help in doing some little bits of preparation, and we threw in just this one little innocuous thing about where he'd hide his phylactery. And it was maybe been a little bit of over-preparedness, but we decided, sort of with Andy's suggestion, that what you do is you make his phylactery, he's done shrink object on it, and it's turned into this cloth-like thing. And he's just got it as a napkin that's in his kitchen, because no one's going to steal a napkin. Of course the players did, but it was, I think, that little bit of preparedness, having those little weird things in, sort of, if the players do this, is always good. So I think that with a lot of it, with your games, especially in the first few sessions and sort of as you're continuing on, to give the players a sense of agency. Make it feel as if the things that they do affect the world and that they have that ability. So it's almost the illusion of choice. You may have an end goal in mind for the game, but I think it's quite important to make sure that your players feel like they have decisions that they can make and you're there guiding them in that direction.
One thing I've actually found is, especially when you get those sort of situations where the player suggests something you haven't prepared for, it's fine to just take a second to say, okay, what do I think the villain or person would do, and just go with that and see where it takes you.
Yeah,
no, I agree.
Don't be afraid to improvise.
Yeah. Well, I think with a lot of it as well, you've got the idea that sometimes you might not be the best at improvising, but if you feel that's something you're comfortable with, you can feel free to improvise with sort of situations you hadn't anticipated. So I think another good point is also to not be expected to know the rules of the game cover. And I think with some editions of games, so for example, D&D 3.5 is notoriously difficult to learn and even harder to master. I mean, I've been running it for about 2 years and I still do not know all of the rules, and it's just not possible to.
I have one thing to say. Can you explain to me how multi-grapples work?
I'm going to answer that question very simply with a no. So
I believe there is a very long and complicated flowchart that attempts to explain it, but it really just made it more confusing.
3.5e is notoriously confusing, and a number of parts of it were quite badly written. But no, I think the main point that with this first point is just to be prepared for your sessions. Some systems require more preparation than others, but make sure you don't over-prepare 20, 30 sessions in advance.
Yes, I think over-preparing is probably worse than under-preparing. Because at least with underpreparing, you can improvise. Over-preparing, you may have a very strong list of things that you need to do, but most of them will never get done, and it can become...
Well, yes, I completely agree. Like, it's often better to underprepare, but at the same time, it's good to have some preparation. So when the party starts trying to ask what an NPC's motivation is, you have an idea of where to go, just so you don't end up writing yourself into a hole, so to speak.
Yeah, I think with some systems, though, preparation is more important than others, I find. So for things like Dungeons and Dragons, there have been times when I've rocked up at a session and it's for a bunch of newbies, and at the beginning I will just go, what adventure do you want? And I think those are some sessions that can work really well, and it tests your improvisational skills. With other systems, so a good example of this would be Call of Cthulhu, you can't go into it with nothing. That's my opinion. I would struggle very much to go into Call of Cthulhu with no prep. If it's just a one-shot, that's a lot easier. But if you're doing a game that's stretching over a few weeks, you kind of need to have it. Because it's a lot of investigation, you do need to have a lot more prep work behind it, is my view.
Yeah, one of the things that I've come to learn about Call of Cthulhu is that the atmosphere is very important. And if you haven't prepared to such an extent where you can establish the atmosphere you need the story to have, it can fall flat. Fortunately, I've never played a bad Call of Cthulhu game.
Given that you've played in my games, I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah. So the second thing I'd like to talk about with you all, we did mention this very briefly, finding out what your players want to play in a game, not just in terms of classes or races, but more what kind of theme of adventure do you want? Do you want something that's more political, or do you want something that's more of a dungeon crawl? A hybrid of the two, or something that's a bit more classical, like saving the princess from the castle. Well, it will promote a more mutually enjoyable game, but it's also for the GM to ensure that the game flows correctly in a way that's enjoyable for everyone.
It's also if the players are playing something they're like wanting to play, they're going to be more invested. Whereas if, say, they kind of are here to essentially hit things with a stick, if they're in a long political slog with various courtiers, they're probably going to lose interest quite quickly.
So I had that very much in one of my games. So it was a Call of Cthulhu game I ran some months ago, and one of the players that had joined was very much gearing for a fight in some instances, and it got to one point where they got sort of quite confrontational with one of the NPCs, and Call of Cthulhu was a remarkably lethal system, and the NPC just swung a single punch and knocked them out cold, and they enjoyed that, but with some systems it isn't viable to go in all guns blazing. But some systems work a lot better for politics, like World of Darkness, D&D. It can be done.
I have an interesting example, at least for this particular point. Although it is a very specific example that is tailored to a very specific kind of player. Now, both of you would know this, given that you are in my Pathfinder game, which is currently on hiatus. When that game was first pitched, we made it. Well, I wanted to make a point that this game is going to be the most absurdly overpowered game I've ever ran, and it has done that perfectly. This is not the kind of game that I would recommend for anybody that doesn't know the rules very deeply and understand that this game is meant to be absurd.
I feel it needs to be pointed out that by the end of the first I think it was like first 6 sittings of it, we were something like level 6 and running around with some CR, or as in like epic level monsters at our beck and call. That's how ridiculous it got.
And then there was my character, who was the item crafter. A lot of us were noble drows, so we are properly evil. And I'm there going I was literally playing the little Ferengi in this, and I was kind of going, oh, I can craft you this item much cheaper than at market price, a mere 70%. And Andy, who's playing the older drow sister, so it's a matriarchal society, so she outranks me. I'm going, but for you, sister, 60%. But no, we had so much money.
Keynote, for anyone looking to run Pathfinder, don't let anyone play Noble Drow. Don't let anyone.
Oh.
The entire party were Noble Drow.
When I first pitched this game, I wanted it to be sensible. Until Andy asked if he could play a Noble Drow. And then Kieran immediately came in wanting to play Noble Drow too, and immediately I was just... fine.
Well, in a lot of games that Andy and I have played in together, either our characters butt heads all the time, but we as players love it, and the GM tends to laugh themselves silly, or we play two characters that work reasonably well together, and the NPCs and the people in the world will suffer.
It did turn into a very fun game, though. I was very happy with the way it came out, but I don't think that game would have succeeded if we had players with a different kind of mindset. When we just kind of resigned to the fact that this game is just going to be bonkers.
Yeah,
it became more enjoyable. And we're just trying to find out how strong could we possibly make the characters at these certain levels, to the point where you're taking on like Crucia demons at 8th level, and they're twice your level. And it's quite
8th?
good.
We weren't 8th.
Well,
we were somewhere like 6th.
The main thing was, I think, going into it, we all understood kind of what the GM was going, in this case Nick, was going for, and we were kind of all on board. Whereas if we'd had people that weren't on board and that weren't particularly comfortable with essentially trying to break the system in as many ways as we could, it wouldn't have worked, because they wouldn't have particularly enjoyed it.
I think the main point with that, though, was the good thing was we were all enjoying it. It was mutually enjoyable for all of us, as in your players knew the system and we were able to have fun, and you had fun watching us have our antics.
It is a great game. I'm looking forward to bringing it back soon.
Yes.
But it's one of those games, I think, that can't be run over a protracted period, because it's meant to be a break from general RPGs. It's meant to be that thing where you can just go roughshod. And now we're going to move over to topic number 3. Andy, if you would.
Yes, so one big piece of advice I'd say to people new to GMing is to avoid getting into the mindset of it being you versus the players, so to speak. Because you and the players should be collaboratively making a story. Like, your kind of role is to challenge them to do that, but it's not a confrontational challenge, so to speak. So, like, an example of this, because I was very much fell into... Well, this was very much a problem of my GMing back when I started GMing. So I ran this D&D module called City of the Spider Queen. It's set down in the Underdark. So got some players. I essentially read through the module, and the thing with the module was a lot of the encounters were balanced at the based on the assumption that the players would only be using options from the core book of D&D 3.5. It didn't account for any of the other books that were released by Wizards of the Coast, and so there were some of these encounters which you'd look at it and say, yeah, this is theoretically a challenging fight. But the minute you kind of assume that someone is using classes or spells, that could just pretty much blow the entire encounter out of the water. And so my kind of GM mind at the time was like, okay, I need to fix this to make them continue to make them challenging. So I'd kind of go through and bump up some of the kind of stats, give some of the enemies ways to counter this, or things the party could do to essentially bypass the entire encounter, which kind of created almost like a toxic mindset, because I was kind of making the encounters harder for the players, whereas they were then finding ways to circumvent these harder encounters, which meant I then started trying to work out how to preempt their circumventions, and it kind of created almost like this arms race where the players are doing things to try and stop me doing things, so I was doing other things to stop them trying to get around it, and it wasn't really a fun environment, so to speak.
I think with that as well, it's almost where the GM starts metagaming, where you start looking at it going, all right, I know that this player uses this strategy, how can I counter that strategy? And I think having enemies have generic strategies can work. Things like, they're used to dealing with spellcasters. This is how they would try and deal with a general spellcaster. But if you go, I know that someone's going to do a polymorph, this is how you deal with that. Like, that's when it starts to become problematic.
Yeah, I very much agree. It's it's weird when you get down to the thing of like, okay, how do I specifically kill each member of the party? And well, that can sort of work in some instances where someone is actively tracking the party and thus have learnt all their strengths and weaknesses. But your average goblin horde shouldn't know that and shouldn't be prepared to directly counter the party. So it's just making sure to avoid that sort of you versus them mindset.
I get you. I mean, it sounds like you could potentially risk the game being quite hostile after a while if it keeps going along that road. And a hostile game is not necessarily a fun game.
I mean, that's pretty much why that game ended. It became a little too hostile for everyone, and we kind of realised that it wasn't really... No one was really enjoying it anymore, so we sort of put an end to it.
I think when issues start happening between players and sort of the GM, rather than between characters, that's when things start to go downhill.
Well, I mean, there are some games that kind of break that rule, where it's players versus the GM, or even players versus players. Paranoia is a great example of that, where it is not about winning for the players, it's about doing less badly than everyone else.
Yeah, and I think that one ties back into the point number 2, where you just sort of need to read what the players want to do, because some players really like the idea of player versus player or character versus character kind of systems, but some other players, like myself included, are not really a fan of these sort of player versus player environments.
Yeah, I mean, there are some instances in even in D&D where there may be a situation of RP in which PvP is inevitable, or if a certain game goes the same way. Most recent example for me is probably Mummy the Curse, which Kieran ran about a year ago, and how that turned out.
Yeah, that was... It was quite ironic, though. So basically in this game, I won't go into huge details about the setting, but they play as basically arisen mummies with a particular purpose. And what was happening was this mummy was spurning the judges that would normally bring the mummies back to life. And it got to the end, the final confrontation, with 4 members of the party and this big bad mummy, and he was going, I have found a way to take power away from them so we don't rely on them anymore. Join me and I'll teach you. And 2 members of the party went, yeah, that sounds really good, actually. And then it literally became a PvP fight. It wasn't expected, but I improvised and I rolled with it.
It happened very organically, and I think that's
Yes.
the best way to have that kind of thing appear in the game.
I think it's this sign of a good villain, where if they start their spiel and some of the party just go, actually, that kind of makes sense. I'm on with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically my entire thought. I was like, this guy is making a very good point. Perhaps I'm doing this the wrong way.
I think one of the other important things as well is that although that fight could have been challenging anyway, there was always a chance for the players to win, which I think is always important, no matter the system, generally. There should always be a way for the players to win. They might need to be smart, they might need to take a lot of risks, but in my mind, so for example, even in some systems where like Call of Cthulhu, where you are facing off against Cthulian entities from beyond sanity, there should be a way for you to succeed, to win. And I think as a GM, you need to make sure that there is that, even if it's a remote possibility, there needs to be that chance for the players.
Also, if the players get into a situation where they realise, there's no way we can win this, we're just essentially along for the ride, that's really, well, it's 1, disheartening, and 2, it really removes any kind of immersion, because you essentially become a spectator in your own show.
So moving on to point number 4, which I think is very important for all GMs, whether you're new or old. Don't panic. You will make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them, and where possible, use that mistake in the game. And I have a perfect example. Actually, I have 2 perfect examples of this. The first one is essentially, oops, I forgot. And we just moved on. The second one was, that should have killed the party, and I completely forgot about it. So these 2 examples are stemming from a game I'm running currently, Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, the 5th edition module, which is, we finished chapter 1, it was very good, I enjoyed it quite a lot. In the first session, the first combat is in the Elsong Tavern, where you are looking for a particular ruffian of Baldur's Gate, who is in hiding, and they managed to find her, and it was pretty good. But she was also being hunted by a group of pirates. Those pirates are expected to appear in the Elsong Tavern, challenge her and the party. Now the leader of the pirates, who is actually quite strong for a first level encounter, I forgot to put on the initiative list. So for basically the entire fight, he did nothing. And I didn't realise that until just before the end of the fight. But when I realised, oh crap, I've forgotten about him. He had about 4 hit points left. So I just thought, no, I'm not going to do anything about that. Kieran was very good about it though, because he was spitting acid at him. So that was that was
it wasn't acid, it was poison.
Poison. Yes, poison spray. Excuse me. The second one was on the following session, and so the hook for that part of the adventure is that they are going after the Dungeon of the Dead Three. The Dead Three being Bane, Baal, and Michael, the gods of death, and so they're going through dealing cultists. It's all good, and they're walking around in what is essentially stagnant water and occasionally a bit of open sewage. One part in that dungeon, and I've got the quote here, just to read what happened, what was supposed to happen, is they're in front of a rotten wooden door that is appears to be forced shut, but it's not locked. And it turns out the reason for that is because there is a build-up of gas on the other side of the door, which is kind of kept it sealed. Now the text specifically says this: the ceiling of this flooded room is supported by numerous wooden beams. The air here smells like rotten eggs, a putrid stench that carries beyond the room. Any character approaching this area who succeeds on a DC 10 Wisdom survival check realizes that the stench is an indicator of a flammable gas in the room. This gas disperses before reaching other areas of the dungeon, and the Dead 3 cultists extinguish their torches before moving through this area. This is the mistake I made, because there were lit torches being carried by more than one member of the party when they went in. Bringing a lit torch or other open flame into this gas-filled room triggers an explosion that fills the chamber. Creatures fully immersed in the water take no damage, but all other must succeed on a DC 15 dexterity saving throw, or take 4d6 fire damage on a failed save, or half on a successful one. All the wooden beams that support the ceiling are destroyed in the explosion, which could cause a roof collapse.
So essentially, they bring fire into the place, they all die.
Yes.
Is this the epitome of rocks fall, everybody dies? I'm glad you forgot, though.
Insofar as, if I remembered that was in there, that particular paragraph was there when you walked through it, the party was dead. You were second level. I think one of you had, I think, about 10 hit points at that time. So even if I took the average, which was 14, the party was going to be dead from there.
Well, it wouldn't kill you. You'd make death saves and the like, but yeah, if you're buried under rubble, you're going to die.
Yeah. But yeah, I realised that I made those mistakes. And we all make mistakes in running games or even playing games. Something, even like the general excitement of the game, you might miss something. which can happen. It's fine. It's not something that you really need to get.
It can also be anything from like something big to, oh, I forgot my enemies. It hasn't acted the entire combat, to something small like, oh, turns out my AC was meant to be like 5 higher, or like my armor class was meant to be 5 higher, so I wouldn't have died. And
Yeah, it's like it could be like the difference between bless and not bless. Like maybe you actually hit, but you forgot to apply bless.
I think another sort of point on this as well is if you make a mistake on a ruling, which I think is bound to happen at some point, especially if it's a system you're not 100% familiar with. So in 3.5, for example, let's say you forget that, I don't know, when a creature gets paralyzed, you can coup de grace them, or they take lots of penalties. Sometimes when I found that out, I will go back and I'll say, hey, like, I've run it like this before, but it should have been done like this. So basically update the players and go, from now on, we'll use the proper way.
probably just for the benefit of everyone, what do you mean by coup de grace?
So it's a lovely term, which essentially is when you have a helpless enemy, and it's kind of like the death blow. So it's when you have the perfect opportunity to line up your weapon and make a perfect strike, which will mean that they are most likely going to die.
So moving on to point 5, Andy.
Yes, so kind of stemming a little from our previous point of what happens when things don't quite go to plan, whether that's mistakes or the players, improvisation is your friend. It is your very best friend. You can get so many ideas, both for what you want to do in the game, where you want the plot to go, not only from thoughts just on the fly of, well, this just popped into my head, but also what your players come up with. So, for example, when you're sitting there and the players are in a group and they're kind of saying, hang on, the guy who gave us this quest, what about if he hired us to find the ancient artifact, so when we take it out of the trap-filled dungeon, he can ambush us and steal it? And meanwhile, there's me behind like the GM screen going, wasn't until now.
I think sometimes the best thing is when the players, they give the GM ideas, and this is one of the rules that people talk about, is sort of like, you don't give the GM ideas. Don't discuss the horrible things they could do, because they might go, that's a brilliant idea, why didn't I think of that? And then you suffer.
That's one of my favourite things about RPGs. That things that nobody thought of can happen, and that they can end up just taking the game to a whole new level in terms of enjoyment.
Well, it also doesn't just apply to like where the plot goes, but also the system. So, like, the rule number one of most RPG systems these days is that the GM can change the rules. You know, plot is more important than mechanics, because at the end of the day, you're playing, like, just telling a story. But it also means that you can almost improvise in like things that don't exist within the book, like the book itself. So, like, an example of this is I recently ran a game of Spire. Well, when I say recently, earlier this year, and like that, it's a game where you're playing essentially the downtrodden masses trying to rebel against the elites in this tower called Spire. And at one point during the game, player managed to get themselves, shall we say, lost in the void between worlds, for reasons. And then I kind of had this idea of when they managed to get back, that they brought something with them, and I kind of got a little bit of inspiration for this from another system called Dark Heresy, which is Warhammer 40k, if anyone recognizes that term. But in that system, they have this thing called warp instability, which is whenever their sorcerers cast spells, there's a chance that they're kind of pulling in things from the wibbly-wobbly void between worlds, tends to make the world also go wibbly-wobbly and not in a good way. And these can range from side effects such as everything in a mile radius now spells the cheese, to all the way to, congratulations, you've just summoned a demon prince. And so I kind of borrowed ideas of that, and so I kind of essentially said to the player, "Okay, you now have this power. Every time you use this power, there is like a track which I will check, and if you use it too much, things will start to happen. And this could be small things like, oh look, things are reality is just a bit wonky for the moment, all the way up to, well, you're probably dead, and maybe the large area around you is also very dead as well. And so this was kind of like ways on how I almost like improvised another system into the game to kind of like enrich the story.
That's very cool. Have either of you ever I won't say lifted, but drew inspiration from non-RPG sources, such as TV shows or movies?
Yes. Hopefully, my Scion players aren't listening in on this, but I ran a couple of campaigns of Scion, which essentially you're playing super-powered people in space because you have like mind powers and. Oh wait, Kieran was one of my players. Oh, it's going to be fun for him. So the first campaign I ran of that, at its essence, I kind of built this entire like intricate plot of kind of they were going into like Japan to look for someone who'd gone missing and all this sort of like intrigue, and the entire plot was a thinly veiled excuse for me to bring up a character from a anime called Gal Gaigar into the setting, just so I could have someone who could summon a giant mecha.
I remember that. We got to the very end of it, and this guy goes off and faces the enemy, and he just turns into like a Gundam type thing, and I'm going, that's interesting.
That sounds like I would want to be involved in that. That sounds like just one of those things where it just happens and you're just like, what?
I mean, sometimes as well, I've taken stuff from TV as well. So I once ran, I think it was a Changeling game. So it's World of Darkness and Changeling, where you play as humans that have been taken by the Fae and you've been twisted and your soul has been ripped to shreds by your journey back through the Thorns.
I prefer to call it PTSD, the game.
Yeah, you have traumatic experiences. So in that, the party were finding effectively kind of magic items in the World of Darkness. So it's basically a dark, through the mirror darkly of our world now. And they found these basically objects which had these strange powers they could activate, which are called relics. And I will be honest that I lifted a number of them from Warehouse 13. So you do get inspiration from lots of different sources.
And I'd say don't stray away from like getting inspiration. Inspiration is what makes some of the best stories. Like if you see something, whether it's in literature, a movie, or just someone mentions it, just feel free to just work it into your game.
I think it's also a good point to speak to other people, because they can be some of the best people to not just give you ideas, but also help you refine them, which is why I tend to talk to Andy quite a lot. And I always give him credit. So in my games, when the players have something horrific happen to them, or a really dark or very interesting idea, I will go, you can thank Andy for that one. But I think it's good to have a sounding board, because it will let you develop and basically nurture your ideas and make them feel more real and more concrete.
I feel like your players wish you didn't.
I think they do, but yeah.
Yeah, so I understand that I have Andy to thank for some particular things in particular games, but having a sounding board is generally a good idea anyway. Mostly because you may have an idea that sounds good, but it may not be as good as you think it is, even if you think it is amazing. Moving on to the next point, I think this is one we've touched on already. Being consistent with your rulings. As Kieran mentioned earlier, perhaps we're in the middle of a game and we are trying to recall a particular rule on a particular system, and we did it wrong, but then we later find out we did it wrong. We can retcon that back out in future games. So, okay, this is, I did this wrong, we're going to do it like this from now on. Or if you want to house rule something, for instance, to make it more fun or less cumbersome or less mechanically bothersome because some rules in some games can be extremely annoying, like grappling. For me,
would
I
also
tend to like house ruling things in a certain way, especially if it promotes flavor.
Essentially, like you said, what you're saying is it should be one rule for everyone, both like the GMs and the players and the NPCs. If it's ruled in one way for someone, it should be essentially ruled the same way for everyone.
Of course, yes, yeah, yeah. Otherwise, you're more or less playing favourites at that point, which is not always good.
In 3.5, I do something like this. So some of the rules, they're there to be changed. I mean, 3.5e was notorious for having some badly worded things, which led to lots of problems. So one thing I streamlined was in 3.5 with your skills. You had a skill called Spot and a skill called Listen, and I just thought that was very silly, so I just merged them together to Perception, much like 5th edition does. And for hiding, you've got one for just being able to hide while not moving, and one for moving quietly. So I just combined those together for stealth. And I think sometimes if you just rule things like that, and as you've said, be consistent between both NPCs and players, it makes it easier on everyone.
I guess one thing also that's very important, especially when it comes around to those things, is don't be afraid to say no.
Yes, that ties in perfectly to being consistent with rulings, especially house rulings. If one person wants something and you say no, but then someone else asks for something that's along the same lines and you say yes, it can create a disparity between players.
I think, so I know I keep going back to 3.5, but I think it's a very good example of this, where in 3.5, generally in most games, there will be some source books which the GM will normally ban or outlaw. And I mean, I do this in my games as well, because there are so many source books in 3.5 that were not written, I feel, with enough sort of insight into what it is like to be a player. A lot of them weren't play tested very well. So sometimes I find that some things are ridiculously overpowered, and you go, right, no to that. But I think it's kind of like an arms treaty between you and the players, going, you can't use this, I won't use it against you. And if I do use it, it won't be against the party. So it could be an NPC does something beneficial for them, but it wouldn't be, yes, this enemy has got access to all these really naughty, nasty spells that you can't have.
And yeah, it's that kind of disparity that then, I guess, creates again this sort of arms race between the you versus them mentality, and isn't really conducive to a good, healthy play environment.
Yeah, so I have a good example of some house ruling I have done in Pathfinder specifically, to do with crafting, because I do not like crafting in Pathfinder as it's written in the core book. I wanted a way
to my benefit.
I wanted a way to expedite it in a way that it becomes more of a secondary background thing. Even though crafting can be important in Pathfinder, obviously, but it's there are other rule sets for crafting which I think do work a lot better, and I may experiment with that in the future. But essentially, with this is the same game that is horribly, ridiculously broken anyway. So messing with crafting, I think, worked quite well for the party, especially when we had one of my players not so unfortunately died. Well, it's characters, not the person. The character was killed, and he made a new character.
Their death saved the rest of the party. They were down in a pit. We were climbing out. They had 3 demons on them. The Crucidemon you mentioned before. He was in lots of enchantment effects, which we couldn't break through, and he couldn't do anything. And I'm there with the rest of the party climbing the ladder. So I take a Qual Tree token, I throw it, and it creates cover for us. He did die, but we survived. We are evil characters, just making that clear.
Also to note, the player themselves was on board with this, even if the character was probably not.
No, and I mean, the way I introduced that character, because of the time-sensitive issues they had within the game in terms of they had to get somewhere pretty quick, they would have spent upwards of weeks sorting out equipment for this character if we were going rules as written for gearing him up. So I more or less just hand-waved that entire thing we assume that you somehow got a missive with a list of ingredients and a place to get them to build them on your way back. So when he joined the party, he was already kitted out to the nines, and ridiculously so. Milo, the character that is being played by Tom, this player in particular, made an amazingly interesting character that I thought was going to die not too long ago, but he didn't, which is good, I guess, for him, not for me. But yeah.
Well, it's also, I guess, moving back onto the point of like essentially saying no, is that as like a GM, if kind of like an aspect of the game doesn't appeal to you or you don't want in there, like whether that be kind of extra classes or like a rule set, it's fine to take it like essentially say I don't want any of this in there. Like as long as the players are essentially informed and on board with it, it's fine. So like for example, I'm in a Pathfinder game every Saturday, done by Richard, and he said I don't want any bags of holding, and bags of holding are like these bags where you can essentially like it's like the TARDIS. It's like a normal bag, but then it's almost like almost like a skip inside, in the way of like you can just keep putting stuff in, and of course that then creates entire problems of like, well, the party is just carrying everything in the dungeon with them, or better examples, the party has put a siege ballista in their backpack. So they can carry around a siege ballista and shoot it out at people. And like, as long as everyone's understanding it, that's fine. Like, I ran a game of Shadowrun, which I mentioned previously. Essentially, it's kind of like D&D in the future with corporations. But when I ran it, I said, okay, I don't want to play with the magic rules. So we're going to play this much more akin to kind of like Cyberpunk, which is another system, but it's essentially more about the technology and the gizmos and that sort of angle, rather than the magic. And I kind of explained it to the party at the start that I wasn't going to play with magic, and like they were fine with that, and it played out pretty well.
So one last thing I'd like to add for in terms of house ruling and being consistent with them is, now some games do have this as a thing, but I like to implement mostly in D20 games at least, if you roll a critical fail on an attack, especially if it's a ranged attack, if you're firing into melee combat from certain spaces far away and they roll a 1, that arrow may end up hitting one of your friends. And we had that happen quite a lot in my 5e campaign that I was running, the Baldur's Gate, where one of the characters, Chris, had I think it happened at least once on every session. He rolled a 1, fired into combat, and hit his party members. And it's a cool little fumble. It's a thing I've always liked to have in there, because a critical fail is meant to be either a spectacular miss or a spectacular accident that happens. But it happened a lot. It really happened a lot. It was quite funny.
Well, actually, just before we move on, I think actually that's fine. Like, it adds an extra flair, in my opinion. Again, as long as you're being consistent with it, it's kind of adds a little bit of, I guess, chaos to things.
Yeah, a bit of chaos is always good. So, moving on to our next point, Andy's going to introduce for us.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of summarizes down to don't be afraid to reward ingenuity, but avoid rewarding stupidity. So I guess I'll kind of explain what I mean by this. So when it comes to don't be afraid to reward ingenuity, like example, back in my Spire game, there was this one point in the story where the party, they were going to rescue this. Essentially, they were being asked to rescue this girl who'd been stuck in this house, and when they got there, there was kind of like this chain that was going from her attached to the floor, and the chain was like magical, which means that in the planning, I was kind of going, okay, so they need to go and find the key, and the key is going to be here, it's held by this person, and they're going to do this. That's not what happened. one of the players pulled out thermite and proceeded to remove the section of the floor that was anchoring to the girl, and just were going carrying this girl and a chunk of the floor around with them as they escaped. And this kind of like pretty much blindsided me somewhat, because I wasn't really expecting them to solve it that way, but I was like, yeah, it works. Like, and it's kind of like when players do something that is, you just kind of almost step away and say, yeah, that didn't expect that. Yeah, just let it happen. So at the time, whereas the flip side, avoid rewarding stupidity. If, say, for example, the party, say, wanders on into a king's court, and then one of the party members says, I'm going to step up there and convince everyone that the king is a traitor. And then, say, I have all of the diplomacy skill in the world. But they don't have any proof that the king is a traitor. They don't have any they haven't done any of the kind of legwork that would be used to try and curry favour away from the king. So essentially they're kind of doing something very stupid without really thoughts upon the consequences. And while you don't really want to reward people for doing that, you want people to reward people for essentially progressing the story in a meaningful way.
So in one of the 5e games that I ran at the club, the party were exploring effectively an ancient abandoned temple, because there's always an abandoned temple. And eventually they'd gone searching through, and they found this secret room. And when they entered inside, they found a room completely filled with rotting plants and everything around it. And there was this tree sat in the centre. And then the tree started talking to them, and it turned out to be a tree ant. And it was so corrupted, it was leaking poison from its veins, and it was basically begging the party, sort of going, please put me out of my misery, please kill me. And the party went, could we get it out of here? And I was sort of going, like it's rooted in here, you don't think it would fit through the door, sort of. They thought about killing it, and then one of the players went, would polymorph work? And I sort of threw me for a minute, and I went, yeah, brilliant idea, that would work. So they ended up polymorphing this tree ant into a sheep, and then taking the sheep out with them outside, and then just planting it down. It still begged for them to put it out of its misery, but it was a great idea, and I just hadn't expected it. So I think that's a good example of when a player can come up with a fantastically awesome idea you didn't expect, just let it happen.
I think, I think the way and how I would summarise it is, if the unexpected happens, consider just rolling with it. So I actually have another story for this. So I ran a one-shot of a system called Mutants and Mastermind. Think superheroes. It's one of the game which is you make a superhero, and essentially you're dropped into a world with other superheroes, and you kind of do anything. And I was running this one-shot where it was a bit of an alternative take on history to a degree. So it was set during just before Pearl Harbor. And the players were on the Japanese side, and they were essentially low-level superheroes who were being sent in ahead of the attack to try and essentially sabotage the base. And so I can't remember what everyone was playing. No, I only really remember one of them was they were playing this. There was this spider hero, where they took a lot of these traits of a water spider, such as, they could breathe underwater, they had webs, they could climb walls, and they were sent in to essentially do some low-level sabotage. The main idea was that they were supposed to avoid the actual superheroes on the base, because they were the equivalent of level 1 and 2, whereas the superheroes were almost the equivalent of level 10 to level 15. They shouldn't have been able to really take them on in a fight, because the idea was you avoid them. But anyway, so we got to this point where I think one of the superheroes was called Captain Clock or something to that degree. He was had time manipulation powers, but he's flying low over the water, and Richard, who's playing the spider character, kind of jumps up grabs him and pulls him under the water. And normally you're kind of like, oh, it's fine. He's like way higher level. He'll get out fine. Looks at his sheet. Didn't have a way to get out of the grapple. So he was just down there, slowly drowning. And, when these sort of situations happen where, you have a person that is meant to be like a big boss encounter, you can look at him being like, can I fudge things, try and get him out of that? And on the other hand, I was like, yeah, no, he's just dead.
I wanted to add this into this particular part of the discussion because it happened yesterday and it was very funny. So we were playing Call of Cthulhu yesterday. Kieran's running the game. If you would tell the story, because it is very good. So one thing I wanted to add for this particular part of the topic, at least, is something that happened yesterday when we were playing Call of Cthulhu. This is the game being run by Kieran. If you would like to tell everyone what happened.
So the Call of Cthulhu game that I'm running at the moment is set sort of around Halloween, and effectively the party are trying to investigate essentially a lot of people that are dying in and around Arkham, Massachusetts, finding themselves dead upon ash trees. And the party yesterday went to investigate, effectively it was this old, apparently haunted house. So the party head in and they keep finding strange things going on, a painting that seems to move and watch them, randomly half-smoked cigars that are scattered around everywhere. And I think the point that Nick was referring to was when one of the party members went particularly insane. And they went insane while they were asleep, and this person is playing as an entomologist. And effectively, when you go insane in Call of Cthulhu, you can gain a number of phobias and manias and that sort of thing. And I think the most ironic thing happened. The player rolled entirely randomly on a table of loads of different phobias, and this person, being an entomologist, of course, doesn't choose, randomly rolls entomophobia, the fear of insects, which, aside from being utterly hilarious, also means the player now has to deal with some interesting consequences of that whenever they go back into work. Because they've been going around to the party going, yes, I'm the only entomologist in Arkham. Oh, you know nothing about insects. So I think sometimes you can just have weird things that will crop up in a game that will just make everybody laugh. And I think that's one of the fun things that can come up when it's just random pieces of randomness.
I have one more, which is pretty much perfect for that. So a friend decided to run like a 5th edition game online. The idea was this is a murder mystery. So there's someone is going to die, and then we need to kind of try and piece together the clues to find out why they died, who killed them, and so on and so forth. But needless to say, before the murder had actually happened, we, for completely unjustified reasons, me and another player suspected something was essentially foul play was going on from one of the NPCs who we thought was acting suspiciously. So we decided to go investigating into his cellar to try and find anything weird, and we came across this essentially his alcohol stores. He'd got crates and crates and crates or barrels and barrels of alcohol. And while we were down there investigating, I may have accidentally flooded the kind of floor with some of the alcohol, and then accidentally set it on fire. Yes, accidentally. Needless to say, we kind of saw the expression heard the expression on the GM, as he was trying to ponder over something, and we're like, we should probably get out of here, as a good half of the building exploded. Needless to say, we apparently solved the murder, because pretty much everyone was dead.
So before we move on, I want to tell you about. I haven't told any of you this story before, but this happened a very long time ago. I think I was about 18 or 19 when this happened. I was joining a 2nd edition AD&D game, and I was trying to come up with a backstory, and I really was drawing a blank, and I couldn't come up with anything I really liked. So I resorted to using one of the many AD&D source books where you can basically roll up a backstory, and they're very useful, and they can become very detailed as well. But I ended up having a very unexpected and heavily contradictory story that made no sense. And essentially what happened was this character, as a child, lost both of their legs, which already sucks. But as they got older, they became an award-winning runner.
Hang on. I'm sorry. What?
Yes. As a child, he lost his legs. He was if I remember correctly, he was the victim of a raid, and his settlement, like the house that he was living in, kind of collapsed on him and just took his legs out. But he grew up. So after all that happened, he grew up with no legs. So it would have been an interesting character to play. I was quite on board with that, because I thought there must be some good ways to get around this. But as he got older, for some reason, he ended, just based on the ways the tables were rolling, he became what is effectively an Olympic sprinter. Needless to say, I did not run with his character because that made no sense.
So maybe he was running on his hands. Maybe.
I didn't know like how to pass that, but I showed it to the guy that I was when I was going through it all, and he just looked at me. He just gave me this completely confused look. He was desperate to try and find a way to make this make sense in the game. I was just like, no, this I can't do this. But yeah, it's just one of those random things that happened. Consider rolling with it. It's not always a good idea to roll with it though, because it would just have been a problem. Maybe if he had one leg, like he'd be really good at hopping or something. I don't know, but. Let's move on to the next point. So this one will be taken mostly by Kieran, if you'd like to introduce it.
Yes. So, effectively, the next point we'd like to make is that it's very important in games, if you've got sort of a good number of players, so anything above 2, generally. It's a very good point to make sure that everyone has a chance to contribute. So sometimes in games, especially if you've got a large number of people, so 5 players and up, it can sometimes be quite difficult to make sure that everybody has a moment in the spotlight. So if in a game it looks like someone isn't contributing as much, what I would normally do is sort of after a session, I'll normally message the player or have a chat with them, sort of go, is everything all right? Are you enjoying it? And sometimes you find players that are very happy to sit back and be quiet. Other times you get the complete opposite, where a player says, I feel like I don't have anything to contribute and I'm not confident enough. So I had an example that happened in my 3.5e game. So I had a party of 6 players, and 4 of them were relatively vocal, 1 of them very much so, and there were 2 players that were very quiet, very withdrawn, very laid back. They weren't contributing as much in group discussions and things like that. And the reason that I sort of had noticed was that there was one particular player in the group who had a classic case of what I like to call single-player syndrome. And this is essentially where you've had people that are so used to playing computer games and the like, and they come in with that single-player mindset.
I mentioned this last episode.
Yes. I think with a lot of it, as Andy has mentioned in the previous episode, is that they're used to coming into a game and they are the star of the show. And this particular player, they felt the need to be involved in absolutely everything that was going on. I would ask one player if they'd like to do something, this player would immediately jump in. And I think sometimes you need to speak to these players. And you need to try and make sure that they understand that it is collaborative. So you've got multiple people in this game, and make sure that other players have a chance to have a moment. You need to give them those moments, give them opportunities to contribute. And if the player isn't willing to take a step back, sometimes, as I have been told, you need to put your Viking GM hat on and go, right, you need to take a step back. You need to let other people contribute, which I did. And effectively the other players then, once that person had basically had been removed from the game because they were being far too disruptive, it was so nice to be able to see the other two players having a chance to contribute, because it looked to me like they weren't having fun.
I guess also a follow-up to like point about that is don't suffer toxic players.
Yes, very much so. As it will never end well. If you, as a GM, constantly find yourself having a problem with that player, it's not going to get any better, generally, unless they are willing to sort of listen to your feedback and your comments. It won't change. And I think I got some advice from sort of some of my other friends about it, and that helped me with it.
Well, I'd also say, like, I guess if we elaborate more, one thing is to do is first of all check it that you're not the problem. But if they are the problem, then if they're not willing to change, they probably shouldn't stay, because they're gonna essentially bring the entire game down for everyone.
Yeah, very much so. And when you do notice that a player doesn't seem to be enjoying themselves and having fun, sometimes it's good to consider making some changes to the way you're doing things. So if you've had a combat that has gone on for 10 rounds, which in real world terms can go up to about an hour and a half, if not more, sometimes it helps to make changes to help re-engage a player, to get them more actively involved. If you notice a player's being quiet, sort of not quite single them out, but go, so I don't know, Thomas, what are you doing? Like, are you involved? Is there anything you want to do? And it just helps you. And if they say, no, I'm fine, it means that they're quite comfortable with what they're doing. But it's always important to check up, to make sure your players are enjoying themselves.
Yeah, this is easier in person, obviously, because you can read the table and see what people are doing. If you've got everybody eyes down looking at the character sheet, but you've got one on their phone or something. I mean, there could be several reasons for why that is, but one of them might be that they're feeling a bit left out, or they've been pushed to the back. This can happen in games that have a very robust social aspect to them. Insofar as when you have, if you're genning a party up, usually you will have somebody who is quote unquote the face, who is the talker, the diplomat, the persuader. And in some games, it can skew towards those particular people and leave the rest of them out. So it's always good to try and involve everybody, even if it's not something they're not necessarily good at. It's good to get their input and have them contribute to the game.
It's also you can do some things to try and avoid these sort of situations coming up to start with. So often, like you see this primarily in D&D, but in most settings, like characters have a sort of role in the party, and there is overlaps. And if you can see an overlap happening, like ahead of time, like when the players make their characters, you can kind of forewarn them. Oh, by the way, like let's say someone's making a rogue. You say, oh, by the way, there's another person that's making a rogue as well. Because if two people are doing the same thing, one person's going to get overshadowed because there's one lock. Oh, two people can't lockpick it. That's when you can like have a discussion to say if there's another direction they want to go. Like, do they want to go more the pickpocketing route, or like spell casting with some sneakery with it? And you can sort of work with them to see if there's like they can find a niche, which means that they are then doing something unique to the party.
Yeah, I mean, there are some characters that are being RP'd in such a way that they will take a backseat. In some aspects, and I have a character that does exactly that. His name is Slab. It's part of a 5e game run by one of our friends, Spawn. Slab is he's a dwarven fighter who has next to no intelligence. He doesn't talk much, but when he does talk, his words tend to just be single syllable words, and maybe passed together in approximately a sentence. But he does hit things very hard.
It was when he got feeble-minded, we barely noticed.
Yes, that did happen. He ran. I believe he charged the door because it was locked, and the only way Slab knew how to open this door was to break it. So he charged into the door, set off a trap that feeble-minded him into what was essentially a babbling child. But because Slab was so not intelligent to begin with, nobody really noticed.
Just to explain what Feeble Mind is. So Feeble Mind is a spell which has been present in many editions of D&D, and essentially what it does is you've got an ability score for your intelligence, which would range from anywhere between base of it is going to be 5, max is normally 20 in most systems. Feeble Mind effectively makes your intelligence 1. So you are just about able to move around. You can't really talk, but you still recognise your friends.
Yeah, I mean, Slab's base intelligence is 6, so it wasn't much of a drop.
Well, when we kind of say intelligence of 1, and it's on a scale of where 10 is an average human, and 1 is like lower than a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, 0 is effectively you can't talk, you are unintelligible, and you cannot really understand anything from the point of communication, at least. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Slab. I did actually get a little bit annoyed when he got feeble-minded, and I realised that I was already playing a fairly limited character in terms of things he can do, and that limited me even more. We did find a way around that though, which just speaks to Spawn being a really good GM. But yeah. So moving on to number 9, I think this is a very important thing that often does get overlooked in terms of in terms of running games and being a member of a game, and that's knowing people's limits in terms of what they would consider to be appropriate for an RPG or taking it too far and then becoming offensive.
I think
Obviously,
this one is very, very important, especially because there have been instances which have appeared in the news, like was it last year or the year before, where people essentially they were running at conventions. Well, there was one person particularly who didn't do this, and it ended badly. And if you don't respect what people are and are not comfortable with, you're going to create a lot of issues.
I think as well, with some systems, they are designed for horror. So, but still respecting people's limits. So, for example, in Call of Cthulhu, you're going into it, you know that it's going to be a horror-themed game, but it's fine to scare your players and to touch on sensitive themes, but I think it's always important that if at any time a player says they're feeling uncomfortable with the current situation, the best thing that you could do is to almost hand wave it, to move on from that topic and almost sort of fade to black, as in sort of just leave it, move away from that sensitive topic.
Don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to listen to someone graphically describe how they're torturing someone.
Precisely.
yeah, I mean there are the general guidelines of good practices there. I think of when too much is too much. Like for instance, I think if you are traipsing through a dungeon and you find a corpse that has obviously been tortured, that's all they need to know. They don't need to know specifically what was done to them, because it may be important that character was tortured for some reason. But moving on from there, so that it is appropriate to the story, but not too graphic as to risk upsetting people. So I've been in games where such things can happen, and people do tend to get people that were offended at least tend to start pulling away from the game, and it can ruin it for everyone else as well.
Yeah, and it's because it's also, if someone's asking for that, like, it's essentially, it's again comes back with almost like the reading the room, and also just asking, just talking to players what they are and are not comfortable with, because it doesn't always have to be kind of graphic things. It could be like it was mentioned, certain like themes such as various things, racism, sexism, any of the other angles which may have been fine back in like the 60s when the game is set, but is not okay now.
I think a good example of this is my Call of Cthulhu game. So that game is set in the 1920s. So I preface the game sort of before I begin, and I've said this to new players as well, that although at the time certain viewpoints on racism and sexism were considered very common, they're not going to come up in the game. As in, you can play whatever character you desire, and your choices will not impact that. It's not to detract away from the fact that those events happened, but it's that I feel they don't have a place in a role-playing game.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably introduce it, providing all players are okay with it. But that would be a very specific instance where I would say that if I want to run my game like this, actually Victoriana is a good example of a game that's like that, which is set in Victorian London, where casual sex and casual racism was normal, at least what we would consider casual racism and sexism to be obviously bad. At the time, it was considered normal. And the game does, on occasion, make a point that some of this should be expected in RP, but there is no reason for that to be the case, unless you're going to build the game specifically to include that. But then you would only have very specific characters, very specific people that would want to play that kind of game, and I would think that's probably not a good idea to explore those topics in that way, at least not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, like, especially the Victorian age in general, there's a very interesting social dynamic they had going on. Not all of it was especially healthy. It's quite interesting to study, but I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't really want to play some of those angles because, let's be fair, a lot of what the Victorians did were more than a little messed up behind closed doors.
Oh yeah, and at the risk of getting too deep into this, I think we'll leave it there at that particular point. So finally, and I think this is also very important. It might actually be the most important of everything we've discussed. Get feedback. You are always going to be your own worst critic. You need feedback from others to improve your games. But don't take it personally.
Constructive feedback.
Yeah, so I think also it's very important on the don't take the feedback personally. Because sometimes people can kind of come across in the wrong way, but if say the group has not been really enjoying what you thought was an absolutely amazing boss fight, then maybe it's just you need to come away and say, okay, let's deconstruct the boss fight. What about it weren't they enjoying, and what can I do to kind of make that more enjoyable? Obviously, as long as the criticism is constructive. So if someone's just there to just rant, that's less helpful.
I think as well, feedback doesn't just have to be negative. Sometimes your players could say something that they really enjoyed, and I think that can be just as useful. So if you find out that your players really enjoyed the investigative side of it, you know that, okay, this general format works. So in my Call of Cthulhu game, after the last session, one thing that Nick said was that it's very hard to get the atmosphere and the balance of Call of Cthulhu right, where you have enough of the investigative side and just a smidge, just enough of the combat that it feels dangerous but isn't deadly. Well, generally.
Yeah, well, one thing that's that has happened quite a lot since we've had to migrate to Discord for obvious social distancing reasons, as well as it's also easier to run games, especially with us when we're because we all play each other's games pretty much now. Which, by the way, if anyone else wants to join in games, please join our Discord group. We're always taking more players. We always want more games. But whenever a game finishes, we tend to immediately ask, "Did you enjoy it? How was the game? Was it okay? Did you have any problems?" And it's always worth bringing that up, because I could think that something was amazing, and as a GM at least, I could think, this is a great idea. I've just come up with an amazing thing. This is going to be awesome. Everyone's going to love it. And then it turns out it sounded awesome, but and because I came up with it, spent a long time statting things up and coming up with it. I was very happy with it. But then it turns out it just didn't flow properly, or it didn't resonate with players. And it's always good to get that feedback. As long as it's good, obviously, positive feedback is always great, but negative feedback is also important, providing it's constructive, as we've said.
Yeah,
otherwise you're just being unfairly critical of someone for...
Yeah, I think it's very important, because sometimes you will get people that will just either they dislike your style of running or they dislike the system itself. And I think it's an important thing to understand that sometimes people will have bad experiences of a particular gaming system and it will colour their opinion for future games. So I know a couple of people, so there's one particular person I know who has had bad experiences with certain games run by particular people, and they will not want to touch that system again because in their mind they've already got that opinion. So I think getting feedback on it can also help improve the way that you run it. It will point out what things do people think that you might need more experience or more practice to run better.
Yeah, I mean it's very important to promoting a healthy game atmosphere. I can't think off the top of my head any particular examples of unfair criticism. So I'm the kind of person that will accept criticism on basically anything. So I think it's important to me to know what other people think when it comes to things like this.
And I think it's a sign of a good GM if they are looking for feedback, because it shows that you're interested in what do the players think you did well? What are the things that they thought that they didn't enjoy? It might be that 5 out of 6 players really enjoyed one piece of it and one other player didn't, but they enjoyed other bits. So different players will enjoy different things. But I think there's always going to be some useful information contained in feedback from players.
Yeah, I mean, actually, no, I do have an example I can bring up, and it's relevant to Kieran's D&D 3.5 game that that I was playing and will be rejoining soon on Mondays.
I hope so.
So we were in a dungeon that was full of traps, and whilst I was enjoying the game, I got super annoyed whilst we were in that dungeon because of all the traps that we kept tripping, because we had no effective trap finder.
It was the same trap over and over again. It was a pit trap. But the party eventually worked out that at almost every corner they went round, there was going to be a pit trap. So what they did was they started summoning donkeys to send over the pit traps to test it.
It was I did enjoy the game. I'm not knocking the game in terms of its enjoyment, but I got very angry with all the traps that were just everywhere. I think I did mention that, just that I was super irritated by that. But
they did have you did have no rogue at that point,
I
so
mean,
you were a little
we
bit stuffed.
We were lacking a key element in most parties.
For context, for those who aren't really knowledgeable about D&D, when they say rogue, it means the person who is doing the sneaky things, and is usually the person finding all the traps.
Yeah.
Yes. It was. I think the thing that really just bugged me was just that I knew there were going to be traps, and as we were exploring the dungeon, and I was like, "There's going to be a trap coming at any moment now." And then I would move one square, and then Kieran would suddenly go and stop right there, as the ground collapses around you, and you've just fallen into a pit trap that's got acid in it.
None of my pit traps had acid. There was a door you opened that produced a fog that was acidic.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
horrible.
yes, it was. Yes, that's correct. That was quite funny though. That acid fog. That was quite good.
I remember one time I was running the City of the Spider Queen, and there's this one door in there that has a death spell on it. And usually players, when they trip a trap, the assumption is that you set the trap off, the trap's now disabled because it's gone off and killed someone. The problem with this door was that it kept resetting the death trap. So I think we lost three different characters to that door because the first person went, touched it, died. Next person was like, oh, it's been disabled. Like, went to open it, died. And then someone else, I think, went and tried it afterwards, and they died again. And that door had more kills than most of the other encounters in that module.
So we're coming to the end of the episode here. There was one last thing I wanted to bring up. As we were coming up with a list of things we wanted to talk about for this particular episode, we did bring up a certain sore point that Kieran has experienced a couple of times in games. Kieran, if you'd like to share it with us.
So one rule that I always have as a player, and it's my own little paranoia, Never trust kindly old women. There's never going to be a good ending to that. As in, I have encountered them where they've been disguised hags, where they've been disguised cultists, where they've turned out to be evil fae queens that are out to get us. And this happened in Nix 5e. We go into this room in this particular dungeon, which I won't name, and we open a door, and inside there's these two lovely old women. And then the entire party going, oh, like, we'll save you, we'll get you out of there. And we had a number of other people in the group as well. And only two of us were suspicious because we rolled and succeeded. And I was going, I just don't trust them. So we then got attacked by some people. And I was there standing in the door, and these old women just started to walk towards the door. And I just barked at them and went, stay where you are for your own protection. Of course, they were cultists, and they almost killed me. And at that point in the session I was going, I knew I was right. I told you I was right.
Everybody in the party almost convinced you otherwise. I said, no, they're fine. Look, there's these old ladies that need to be saved. No, they were
one of these days, I want to run like a session where they find a kindly old woman in a dungeon where she probably isn't supposed to be, and she keeps doing kind of slightly suspicious things. So the party might do something. I don't know, they might end up killing her or doing stuff. At which point, the actual villain shows up and is like, Gran, you killed Gran, and she was just a kindly old lady.
One day.
Maybe we should have a dungeon where the kindly old woman is actually a kindly old woman.
Yeah,
because that doesn't happen. But with that, I think that will round it out for this particular episode. Everybody, thank you for listening. We will be hosting another one 2 weeks from now, the 6th of November, I believe. But with that said, I am Nick. I've been your host alongside Kieran and Andy. Thank you for listening, and have a good week all. Take care.